1856, Louisiana. A night meant for music, laughter, and vows of eternal love instead descended into one of the most haunting stories whispered in Southern folklore. Imagine it. A sprawling plantation draped in white ribbons, lanterns glowing like captive stars against the thick summer air. The bride, radiant in lace, walked the path of roses laid by servants whose hands trembled not from joy, but from exhaustion and silence. Guests filled the hall, their polished shoes tapping against oak floors, violins rising in harmony with laughter and clinking glasses. A feast stretched across polished tables, roasted meats dripping with fat sugared cakes glittering under candlelight, goblets of wine catching the fire's glow. It was a portrait of abundance, of celebration, of power dressed in elegance. But joy has always been fragile. Within hours, smiles would twist into grimaces, laughter into choking coughs. One by one, guests collapsed, their bodies seizing, eyes rolling back as screams tore through the hall. Panic spread like fire across silken gowns and polished silver. Some clawed at their throats, others convulsed on the floor, knocking over goblets that spilled crimson wine like blood across the linen. The wedding had become a funeral, the hall a crypt. And in the center of every whisper stood one figure, the maid who had prepared the feast. Her name, half remembered in scattered records, has never been agreed upon. Some claim she was quiet, obedient, overlooked. Others described a woman carrying the weight of untold cruelty in her eyes. The story splits here. Some say she poisoned the family in an act of vengeance, reclaiming power in the only way she could. Others insist she was no mere maid but a vessel, guided by ancient knowledge of roots and herbs, turning a banquet into a ritual of death. The contrast is chilling. Marriage, a sacred union meant to bless a family's future, shattered by betrayal hidden in the very food meant to nourish. Was this a human crime, a desperate act of rebellion born from chains and humiliation? Or was it something darker, something that science could never quite name? Across the American South, tales of servants accused of poisoning masters were not uncommon. Food, after all, was intimacy. It passed the lips, entered the body, and could just as easily sustain life as end it. Yet this case stands apart. Too theatrical, too devastating, too shrouded in contradictions. Historians cannot untangle it, priests could not purify it, and folklore refuses to let it die. Even now, locals whisper that if you walk near the ruins of the old plantation, you might hear humming in the night, a lullaby drifting from the kitchen where pots once boiled with death. Was she victim, villain, or something beyond either? The answer lies buried in the shadows of that cursed wedding night, and tonight we open the doors to its story. She entered the world in silence, not with the cries of freedom but beneath the heavy air of chains. Born into the shadows of a Louisiana plantation in the early 1800s, her first lullabies were not songs of tenderness but the groaning of wooden floors, the rustle of overseers' boots, the muffled sobs of mothers who knew their children were not theirs to keep. Her identity was written not on paper but on property ledgers, her worth measured in labor hours, not in human dreams. To the white family who claimed dominion over her life, she was a body, a tool, an extension of the kitchen fire. To herself, she was a ghost moving between shackles and shadows. The plantation kitchen was her nursery and her school. Smoke from wood-burning stoves clung to her skin as she learned to stir pots too heavy for her thin arms. Her palms blistered from lifting iron pans before she had reached adolescence. Other children played with dolls carved from scraps of cloth. She played with knives, herbs, and recipes whispered by older women who worked beside her, women who taught survival through food. Cooking in her world was never an art of celebration. It was a negotiation with cruelty, a language to soothe angry masters, a way to delay beatings, a means to win small mercies in a world designed to deny them. She baked bread not for herself but to sweeten the mouths of those who mocked her. She prepared roasted meats knowing her stomach would rarely taste the same cuts. She learned that sugar could create delight, and that salt rubbed into wounds stung longer than any lash. The kitchen was her sanctuary and her prison, a place where the fire warmed her hands yet burned away any illusion of freedom. Psychologists would later argue that children raised in perpetual bondage suffer a corrosion of empathy. To see cruelty normalized, to live where humiliation is constant, reshapes the brain. She had watched mothers sold away from infants, fathers broken by whips until they were unrecognizable, young boys forced into labor before their voices changed. Trauma was not an isolated wound. It was a river that flooded every corner of her existence. Empathy, if it existed, had to survive inside cracks, fragile as embers. For some, it flickered into resilience. For others, it twisted into rage. In whispered history, stories of slaves accused of poisoning masters were not rare. Food was the one space where the powerless touched the powerful directly. What a master ate, a servant had prepared. A spoonful of soup could carry comfort or a hidden blade. In Virginia, in Georgia, in the Carolinas, records survive of panicked families suspecting servants of slipping arsenic into wine or grinding glass into bread. Sometimes the accusations were unfounded, a reflection of paranoia more than reality. Other times evidence suggested intent, herbs crushed not for healing but for harm. In these cases, the line between survival and vengeance blurred beyond recognition. Was she aware of these stories? Almost certainly. In kitchens, women spoke in codes, whispering while kneading dough, their words hidden beneath the sound of knives on chopping blocks. Children absorbed these fragments, piecing together truths adults dared not say aloud. She learned early that roots could heal fever, and also stop a heart. That seeds boiled in wine could ease childbirth or end a pregnancy. Knowledge passed not through books, for she was forbidden to read, but through memory and ritual. Religion entered every corner of her life, but not always in harmony. The master's house echoed with Christian sermons demanding obedience. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, as you would Christ. Priests thundered these words as chains rattled at the feet of those listening. But within the quarters, another set of hymns lived. African-rooted traditions carried across oceans, memories of spirits tied to herbs, rivers, and the soil itself. These songs spoke of balance, of justice, of unseen powers that punished cruelty. Where the master's faith demanded silence, the old ways whispered that silence itself could be broken. To the outside world, she was invisible. A maid, a shadow slipping between rooms, her voice unheard, her gaze lowered. Yet inside, she carried dual traditions. The enforced Christian obedience that told her vengeance was sin, and the ancestral memory that suggested perhaps vengeance was justice. The duality carved itself into her psychology. To serve was survival. To resist was suicide. But in the recesses of her mind, perhaps there grew the seed of possibility. What if food, the very tool of her captivity, could also become her weapon? By adolescence, she had become indispensable. Her bread was soft, her stews hearty, her desserts delicate enough to impress wealthy visitors. Guests praised the family for their hospitality, never knowing the hands that prepared it belonged to a girl whose back bore scars from whips, whose nights were filled with the muffled cries of others punished for crimes of disobedience as small as looking a master in the eye. She learned to mask her thoughts, to smile when ordered, to bow her head while her mind raced with visions unspoken. Every humiliation left its mark. Being ordered to prepare food she would never taste. Being struck for a mistake she had not made. Being told she was blessed to serve even as her body ached with exhaustion. Slowly, nourishment twisted into something darker. Flour became not just the basis of bread, but a blank page for revenge. Wine became not only sweetness, but an opportunity for bitterness. Cooking was no longer just sustenance, it was possibility. A space where choice, however small, returned to her hands. Historians often debate, does trauma inevitably forge killers? Or does it simply create people who long for an impossible justice? In her case, perhaps it was both. Shackles had defined her life, but shadows had taught her to adapt. She could not strike with weapons, but she could strike with recipes. She could not challenge her master with fists, but she could use his appetite against him. By the time whispers of her skill reached beyond the plantation, she was already something of a legend among the quarters. Children admired her ability to stretch meager rations into meals that filled bellies. Women sought her knowledge of herbs to soothe fevers or heal wounds. Men trusted her with secrets, knowing she would not betray them. Yet beneath admiration lay fear too. Some believed she carried more than knowledge, that when she worked with roots she was invoking spirits, channeling something beyond human hands. Her eyes, they said, lingered too long on certain plants, as if listening to voices others could not hear. The Christian faith of the plantation sought to quash such beliefs. Priests condemned African traditions as demonic, insisting that obedience was salvation. Yet the old ways refused to die. Herbs healed when prayer failed. Roots protected when scripture did not. In her hands, these traditions blurred. Did she boil herbs because she had been taught their practical uses, or because she believed in their hidden power? The answer remains lost, buried in silence. As years passed, her reputation deepened, though always in shadows. To the family, she was an efficient maid, skilled and loyal. To the enslaved community, she was both healer and possible conjurer. To herself, she was a paradox, bound in shackles, moving through shadows, yet carrying knowledge that could tip the balance between life and death. Every act of service became a rehearsal for what might come. Each loaf of bread tested her control. Each glass of wine offered the temptation of defiance. Each pot she stirred whispered questions only she could answer. Would you dare? Could you? Her childhood had been stolen, her choices stripped, her voice silenced. But the kitchen gave her a stage, however hidden, and the ingredients around her became symbols. Salt for wounds, sugar for deception, roots for healing or harm. Cooking was her grammar, and in it she learned to write the story of her resistance. The question historians still ask lingers here. Was her knowledge simply practical, passed down for survival? Or was it mystical, rooted in traditions older than the plantation itself? Was she a servant preparing meals or a priestess weaving curses into stews? By the time the wedding was announced, her life had been one long preparation. Shackles had defined her body, shadows had shaped her soul, and as the family celebrated the promise of a new generation, she stood at the threshold of legend. The feast would not simply be a meal. It would be her reckoning. The day dawned with a deceptive softness, the Louisiana air painted in hues of gold as sunlight spilled over cotton fields heavy with bloom. For once the plantation pulsed not with the crack of overseers' whips, but with anticipation. A wedding was a spectacle, a declaration of wealth and continuity. The heir's daughter, draped in lace imported from Paris, would step into womanhood beneath arches of roses. The grounds had been polished into perfection. Gravel paths were swept, lanterns hung from oak branches, violins tuned until the strings trembled with readiness. Guests arrived in carriages that glittered with polished brass, their laughter rolling through the humid air like thunder before a storm. At the center of it all, unseen by the silk-draped eyes around her, stood the maid. She moved through the kitchen like a shadow given flesh, orchestrating the chaos with quiet authority. Servants darted to and fro, carrying trays, uncorking bottles, kneading dough. But all of them took cues from her. It was her hands that decided when the bread was ready, her nose that judged the stew, her voice, low, firm, that corrected mistakes before they became disasters. To the family, she was a servant. To the feast itself, she was the unseen conductor of a symphony of abundance. Tables groaned with excess. Roast venison glistened beneath streams of gravy. Pies oozed berries so rich they stained fingertips like ink. Decanters of wine caught the light, ruby liquid glowing like captured fire. Platters of sugared almonds and candied citrus waited to sweeten the tongues of the privileged. The very air swelled with the perfume of roasted meat, baked bread, and honeyed confections. To the guests, this was joy incarnate, love celebrated through indulgence. To her, it was something else. Each dish bore her touch, and within that touch lingered the possibility of vengeance. The question of intent haunts history. Did she plan this moment long before, as each humiliation carved itself deeper into her bones? Or did the decision arise suddenly, an impulse hidden within the rhythm of preparation? What is known as this? Herbs, powders, tinctures, or perhaps something darker, found their way into the feast. Perhaps they were slipped into wine where sweetness masked bitterness. Perhaps into sauces thick enough to conceal grains of powder, perhaps into desserts where sugar cloaked the invisible. She alone knew where the shadows were hidden. Religion and psychology clashed violently in later retellings. Priests thundered that no human woman could have orchestrated such a massacre without demonic possession. They insisted her body was overtaken, her hands guided by forces eager to desecrate holy matrimony. Yet others, speaking in hushed tones, suggested otherwise, that this was not madness nor possession, but a deliberate act of justice. For how long can one endure chains before deciding to strike back, however violently? Was she an instrument of hell, or the embodiment of rage long silenced? Eyewitnesses left fragments of testimony, each one dripping with dread. One woman recalled how laughter rose like music, only to splinter into coughing fits so sharp they bent bodies in half. Another swore that when the first glass of wine was raised in toast, the liquid shimmered unnaturally in the candlelight, as though warning them of what was to come. A servant claimed the bride's smile faltered midway through her first bite of cake, her lips paling before she collapsed. Others insisted the air itself seemed to shift, as if shadows had thickened around the tables. At first, the celebration unfolded flawlessly. The bride descended the staircase, lace trailing behind her like a river of snow. The groom, flushed with wine and triumph, took her hand as violins sang. Guests clapped, cheered, kissed cheeks, toasted futures. The feast began, forks clattering, conversations weaving together into a tapestry of noise. Every sound was alive with abundance. Every face was painted with delight. For a brief moment, the plantation existed in a fantasy where cruelty was forgotten, where the enslaved were invisible, where wealth and privilege disguised itself as happiness. And then slowly the fantasy cracked. It began with a cough. Sharp, sudden, tearing through laughter like a blade. Heads turned, amusement rippling into confusion. Then another guest coughed, this one louder, more violent. A child screamed as her father slumped forward, knocking over a goblet of wine that spilled across the white tablecloth like blood. The bride's aunt pressed her napkin to her lips, only to find crimson staining the cloth as her gums bled. Panic spread like fire leaping from dry grass. Voices rose, chairs scraped, plates shattered against the floor. The music faltered, violins screeching to silence as chaos erupted. Men staggered, clutching throats, their faces flushed then drained of color. Women convulsed, their gowns twisting around limbs as they fell. Wine spilled, food scattered. The abundance of the feast transforming grotesquely into weapons of death. What had been symbols of celebration, roast meats, sugared fruits, golden breads, became grotesque emblems of betrayal. Guests who moments before praised the cook's skill now gasped for breath, eyes wide with horror, mouths foaming with the very food they had praised. Eyewitnesses said the cries were unlike anything they had ever heard. Not the shouts of battle nor the wails of mourning, but a chorus of confusion. Voices demanding to know what invisible hand had struck them. Servants froze in terror, unable to flee, trapped in the nightmare of watching power itself crumble before their eyes. Some claimed the bride's veil was torn as she collapsed, lace-soaked in wine and vomit. Her beauty destroyed in the instant it was meant to be celebrated. The maid moved among them quietly, as though untouched by the storm. To some it seemed she drifted like a specter, her face unreadable. Did she watch with satisfaction? Did she tremble with fear at what she had unleashed? Or was she calm, resigned, as if she had known all along this moment would come? Accounts differ, but all agree she did not cry out, did not panic, did not falter. In that silence, people saw either guilt or possession. The clash of innocence and evil reached its peak here. Love, family, abundance, all that the wedding symbolized collided violently with betrayal, death, and revenge. Parents clutched children only to feel their small bodies convulse. Husbands held wives who stiffened in their arms. The bride's dreams curdled into nightmares before her eyes could even close. Every promise of tomorrow was shattered on the banquet tables. Survivors later described staggering into the night, desperate for air, for distance, for answers. The once bright lanterns seemed dim, their light mocking as screams echoed behind them. Horses reared, carriages overturned, guests fled into fields, gowns torn, shoes lost, dignity forgotten. The plantation that had once been the epicenter of wealth now resembled a battlefield. And through it all, one question refused to fade. What had truly happened? Had a maid, scarred by years of bondage, chosen to strike her oppressors at their most joyous hour? Or had something far older, far darker, moved through her, using her as a vessel to exact a reckoning beyond human will? The feast was remembered not as a union of love, but as a celebration stained, forever cursed by death woven into bread, wine, and laughter. What should have been the planting of new life became instead a harvest of shadows, and in the silence that followed, whispers began, whispers that would never die. Was she victim, villain, or something in between? The aftermath of the wedding feast was not silence, but chaos echoing through every corridor of the plantation. Bodies littered the dining hall like fallen soldiers after a battle. Survivors stumbled into the humid night, vomiting into the grass, clawing at their throats, some collapsing in heaps that still twitched with convulsions. The air carried not only the stench of spilt wine and roasted meat, but something more acrid, an invisible presence that clung to lungs and memories alike. When dawn broke, the horror was no longer whispers. It was a spectacle. Physicians, priests, and curious neighbors arrived, drawn by the irresistible pull of disaster. What they encountered was beyond their comprehension. Dozens lay dead or dying. Others babbled incoherently, claiming they had seen shadows move across the wine as though alive. Some insisted the bread had sung to them before turning to ash in their mouths. Science and superstition collided violently, each side struggling to name the nightmare that had unfolded. The physicians were the first to attempt explanation. Armed with their satchels of powders, leeches, and worn volumes of medical lore, they bent over the corpses with grim determination. They examined the purpled lips, the bloodshot eyes, the foam clinging to corners of mouths. They catalogued the stiffness of limbs, the bloating of stomachs, the strange discoloration of tongues. To some, it was arsenic, the most notorious poison of the age, cheap, effective, and nearly undetectable in food and drink. Others suspected ground glass, a cruel weapon hidden in stews or cakes, shredding insides until blood drowned the body from within. Yet the evidence refused to sit neatly within their diagnoses. Arsenic killed, yes, but usually with more prolonged agony, not the swift convulsions witnessed that night. Ground glass left traces of blood and vomit, but none was found on the linen napkins stained with bile. One physician pointed to herbs, nightshade, foxglove, or jimsonweed, plants known to enslaved communities both as remedies and as agents of death. But again, the symptoms contradicted certainty. Some guests screamed of visions before death, clawing at invisible specters in the air. Others lost speech entirely, their eyes rolling back into their skulls. A few, miraculously, recovered within hours as though nothing had touched them. Poison explained much, but not all. The priests saw opportunity in this gap. To them, what could not be explained by science must belong to the realm of the divine, or the demonic. They stood at the edges of the carnage, crucifixes glinting in candlelight, whispering prayers over bodies that still twitched. Their sermons rose quickly, sharp and fevered. This was no human crime but a blasphemy. The devil, they declared, had walked into the kitchen and found his vessel in the maid. Her hands had been guided, her pot stirred not by mortal rage but by infernal will. The wedding, a symbol of sacred union, had been desecrated by unholy intrusion. Yet not all priests agreed. Some, quieter but no less firm, murmured that perhaps the maid had not been possessed but chosen. Chosen as an instrument of ancestral spirits, voices older than the cross itself. They recalled the whispered traditions carried across the ocean by the enslaved, fragments of African spiritual practices woven into daily survival. Herbs, they noted, were never just food. They healed, soothed, strengthened, but in the wrong hands they could kill. To some, she was not an agent of the devil but a priestess cloaked in silence, channeling vengeance older than the plantation walls themselves. Psychologists, writing years later, attempted to strip the story of mysticism. They spoke of trauma, of rage curdled into psychopathy, of a mind so fractured by cruelty that empathy dissolved. Was the feast a calculated act of justice, a symbolic inversion of power where the oppressed poisoned the oppressor with the very tools of servitude? Or was it the breakdown of a tortured psyche, unable to distinguish survival from destruction? To them, the humming some survivors swore they heard in the food, the lullaby said to rise from bowls of stew, was not magic, but projection. A mind unraveling in terror hears songs in silence, shadows in light, curses in wine. Still, the testimonies cannot be dismissed. Survivors spoke with consistency, though each detail seemed stranger than the last. One bridesmaid swore she saw the maid smiling softly as the bride collapsed, a smile too serene for such chaos. Another guest claimed the wine glass in his hand rippled though no one had touched it, as though the liquid itself recoiled. A servant whispered that when she lifted the roast goose, she felt it vibrate, humming like a struck chord. These were not the symptoms of poison alone. They were experiences that bent reality. Science stumbled, religion thundered, folklore blossomed. Neighbors carried the tale into town, embellishing with each retelling. Some said the bread bled when broken. Others claimed shadows darted across the ceiling, though no one walked below. Priests warned that Satan's hand still lingered in the ruins of the kitchen, ready to claim any who dared mock the sacred. Herbalists whispered admiration for the maid's knowledge even as they feared it. Children were told never to waste food, lest the cook's spirit return to finish what she began. The clash between explanation and myth became its own theater. Physicians wrote reports dry and clinical noting discoloration, convulsions, death by ingestion. Priests published pamphlets, fiery with condemnation, warning that no science could stand against the devil's craft. Meanwhile, within the quarters of the enslaved, stories spread like wildfire. To them, she was no demon but a hero, a woman who had bent the tools of oppression into instruments of vengeance. Food, once the language of servitude, had been transformed into rebellion. Yet even among her own, fear coexisted with admiration. Some whispered she had gone too far, that she had not only punished masters but doomed innocents. The children, the servants, even the bride, who some claimed had shown her kindness. Others believed no one was innocent in that house of chains. Was her act an overreach of rage, or the only justice possible in a world without courts for the enslaved? The plantation itself seemed stained with questions. Physicians returned, poking at soil samples, testing for traces of arsenic. Priests returned, sprinkling holy water across scorched stones. None found what they sought. The earth gave back no secrets, the walls no confessions. The kitchen stood silent, its hearth cold, its shadows deeper than before. Psychology, religion, and folklore braided themselves into an inseparable knot. Was she a calculating poisoner, her mind sharpened by years of humiliation into a blade of vengeance? Was she a vessel for the devil, her body turned into a chalice of ruin? Or was she a priestess cloaked in rags, channeling spirits older than the plantation's wealth, older even than the soil of Louisiana itself? The survivors themselves deepened the riddle. They did not agree, yet each account felt weighted with sincerity. Some said they felt a curse woven into every bite, as though the act of eating sealed their fate. Others described hallucinations so vivid they swore reality itself had cracked open. One man claimed he saw the maid's face multiply across the room, reflected in wine glasses, her eyes watching from every corner. Another insisted the bride rose again briefly, her lips moving in a language none understood, before collapsing for the final time. Science could not record such visions. Religion could not reconcile them. Folklore embraced them, weaving them into the growing legend, and so, history faltered at the crossroads. Reports exist, but none align. Some physicians swore it was arsenic, their notes clinical, detached. Others insisted on nightshade, a verdict as murky as the swamp waters nearby. Priests declared it proof of the devil's hand, while whispers in the quarters called it justice served on silver platters. Each explanation contradicted the next, leaving only the certainty of death and the memory of terror. The enigma grew, not diminished, with every attempt to define it. For the more the story was studied, the more it resisted clarity. Science could not prove. Religion could not contain. Folklore could not be silenced. The truth dissolved, leaving only fragments. Songs in the food, shadows in the wine, the smile of a maid as joy turned to screams. And as the debate raged, one fact became undeniable. The survivors' voices, fractured and trembling, carried more weight than any report or sermon. They had lived it. They had felt the poison burn their throats, had seen the shadows move across the table. Their testimonies, strange and unprovable, became the most haunting evidence of all. The night had ended, but silence did not mean peace. Survivors scattered across the plantation grounds carried fragments of memory like shards of broken glass. Dangerous to hold, impossible to let go. Their voices, collected in scraps of testimony and whispered recollections, shaped the legacy of that wedding banquet, far more than any official record. Doctors had theories, priests thundered warnings, but it was the trembling voices of those who lived through the horror that gave the tragedy its eternal pulse. The bridesmaid, her hair once adorned with jasmine now streaked with gray long before its time, swore she had seen the maid smile in the instant the bride collapsed. It wasn't joy, she insisted decades later, clutching her rosary with fingers that shook. It was something darker. I knew in my bones she had been waiting for that moment. A smile like that isn't human. It was triumph. The image clung to her so tightly that she confessed she sometimes saw it in the faces of strangers passing her on the street, a grin that seemed to bloom from shadows. Her recollection was not the only one steeped in terror. A young servant who had poured the wine that night remembered the liquid shifting unnaturally inside the goblet. It moved on its own, he whispered, refusing to drink even water from a glass cup for the rest of his days. It shivered before my eyes like it had a soul or a curse swimming inside. And when the master lifted it, I wanted to scream, but my voice froze. His account fed superstition, for neighbors began to claim that the wine itself had been haunted, a vessel for revenge carried not by poison, but by spirits beyond comprehension. Still others carried stories that stretched the boundaries of belief. A neighbor who swore she had no reason to lie told of a plague that leapt from the feast to the fields. Livestock died in droves, she said, and children burned with fever. We buried 3 lambs and 2 babies before the month was out. It was not poison. It was a curse, and curses do not stay confined to walls. Her tale spread like wildfire, convincing many that the maid had been more than a servant. She had been an agent of wrath, wielding powers no doctor could chart. The contradictions mounted. Some swore she was a monster, a heartless killer whose hands had stirred venom into the food. Others, often the marginalized who had suffered under the weight of the plantation's rule, called her a martyr. She did what no one else dared, one whispered decades later. She broke the chains by breaking the feast. For one night the masters were powerless, brought low by the hands they had ignored. This interpretation rebranded her not as villain but as avenger. Her act transformed into resistance cloaked in violence. Psychologists who studied the testimonies years later argued that memory, especially under trauma, reshapes itself. Survivors' visions of wine moving or shadows dancing in food might have been born not of fact but of shock. The brain's desperate attempt to make sense of senseless terror. Hallucinations, nightmares, fragmented voices in the dark. These became coping mechanisms, wrapping the unbearable in the fabric of supernatural explanation. Yet even this analysis offered no comfort, for whether born of poison or memory, the horror remained equally real. Priests, however, rejected the language of trauma. To them, these testimonies were evidence of sin punished and evil loosed. They declared the maid possessed, her smile proof of the devil's hand. The devil laughs when the innocent fall, one sermon thundered, quoting the bridesmaid's recollection as divine evidence. Survivors, unwilling to challenge their priests, allowed their testimonies to feed the furnace of fear, turning private nightmares into public scripture. But for every survivor who claimed terror, another whispered of pity. One servant, who had escaped the banquet hall by chance, said she heard the maid humming while stirring the food earlier in the day. It wasn't a curse she sang, the servant insisted, but a lullaby. She was calm, not cruel. I think she believed she was delivering them to sleep, not suffering. This fragile memory suggested intent shaded by delusion, painting the maid not as a monster but as a woman broken, convinced her act carried mercy cloaked in vengeance. The tension between these testimonies created a tapestry too tangled to unravel. Memory, that fickle witness, betrayed them all. One claimed the bride gasped before falling. Another insisted she never made a sound. Some said the maid stood frozen as chaos erupted. Others claimed she vanished instantly into shadow. Each contradiction bred more questions. Had the survivors seen truth, or had they invented stories that allowed them to survive their guilt? Nightmares followed them for years. The bridesmaid woke screaming, convinced the smile lingered above her bed. The wine pourer swore he heard glasses clinking in empty rooms. Neighbors claimed their animals startled at unseen figures in the night. Survivors gathered sometimes, whispering to each other, not to find comfort but to ensure they were not alone in their madness. Their shared suffering became its own curse, a haunting carried within their minds. The most chilling testimonies came not in words but in silence. Some survivors never spoke of the banquet again, yet their eyes betrayed the weight they bore. Children born after the massacre grew up in houses where laughter was scarce and shadows seemed longer. Silence became its own testimony, a refusal that spoke louder than screams. Even those who believed in science struggled to dismiss the stories outright. The details were too vivid, the emotions too raw. A rational explanation, poison, tainted food, contamination, could never erase the image of a smile witnessed at the moment of death, or wine that seemed to move with life of its own. Science demanded proof. Memory delivered only fragments. And so the survivors' voices lingered in the borderlands between fact and myth, never fully belonging to either. As the years passed, their testimonies became folklore. Children whispered the stories under blankets. Bridesmaids crossed themselves at weddings. Servants checked their cups twice before drinking. The survivors had become unwilling prophets, their fractured memories shaping a legend that outlived them. Some were mocked as liars, others revered as seers, but all carried the same burden. Truth was unreachable, locked behind trembling voices. And perhaps that was the cruelest curse of all, for the massacre did not simply kill bodies, it fractured memory, poisoned trust, and left survivors adrift between worlds. Their accounts gave the tragedy its shape, but the shape was jagged, contradictory, impossible to hold without bleeding. Science could not resolve it, religion could not contain it, folklore could not silence it. What remained were voices, a bridesmaid clutching her rosary, whispering of a smile, a servant refusing to drink from glass, A neighbor burying lambs and children together, a silence heavier than any scream. These were the testimonies that outlived doctors, priests, and historians. They remind us that memory is not truth but survival, and survival carries its own distortions. And as their contradictions echoed through time, the myth of the poisoned wedding grew stronger than the facts ever could. The massacre did not end with bodies collapsing on the floor of a banquet hall. In fact, the physical deaths were only the beginning. What lingered long after the blood was washed away, after the plates were shattered, after the wine had dried into a sticky black crust, was something far more enduring. Story. From the moment the first whispers left the plantation gates, her name became smoke, shifting, curling, taking new shapes in the mouths of those who spoke it. The maid was never allowed to remain a single person. She was transformed again and again, monster, martyr, ghost, witch, folk hero. The facts grew cold, but the legends burned hotter with each telling. Some swore she was executed beneath the plantation's oldest oak, the same tree that had once shaded the overseer's quarters. "I saw her swing," said one farmhand decades later, though his story changed with each retelling. Sometimes she was silent, neck broken instantly. Other times she screamed until the crows scattered into the sky. Children in nearby villages grew up pointing to that oak, daring each other to touch its bark, whispering that if you pressed your ear against it, you could still hear the rope creaking. But others denied the hanging entirely. They said she vanished into the swamps before the sheriff could catch her, melting into the reeds like a shadow. Hunters claimed they heard her humming at dusk, her voice gliding across the water. Fishermen swore they saw a figure watching them from the tree line, her face pale, her hands wet with swamp mud. In this version, she never died. She became untouchable, eternal, part of the marsh itself. Another group insisted on a fire. "They burned her," whispered one preacher, "because evil cannot be buried." According to this tale, her ashes were scattered over the fields, mixed into the soil that fed future harvests. When crops withered or blight struck, farmers said it was her revenge rising from the ground. Children were warned not to play in the fields at night, lest her ash cling to their skin and draw them into her curse. Folklore did not stop at her death. It spread into kitchens where her ghost found eternal employment. Cooks across the South began to claim that pots stirred on their own, that spoons rattled without being touched, that soft lullabies hummed just as water reached a boil. Mothers warned daughters to cover food properly, for if left unattended, the maid might season it herself. To waste food became a sin not against God but against her. For every wasted morsel risked inviting her spirit to sit at the table. The legends mutated with each decade, molded to fit the fears and morals of the time. In church pulpits, priests transformed her into a warning about possession. "The devil walks through servants," they thundered, pointing to her story as proof. For children, she became a bedtime bogey woman. Parents warned that if they refused to eat, the maid would slip into their rooms at night holding a poisoned spoon. In fields, she was remembered as both curse and justice, a woman who fed poison as retribution for generations of cruelty. Historians who later sifted through the accounts found themselves trapped in circles. Records were too thin, testimonies too contradictory. Was there really an execution order? Did court records vanish, or were they never written? The absence of proof became its own kind of evidence. Proof that her story was too dangerous to be written, too haunting to be contained. Some scholars reframed her as a proto-feminist icon. They argued that her act, if indeed she poisoned the feast, was less about murder and more about rebellion, a woman's body striking against the chains of servitude. In academic journals, she was stripped of demonic possession and recast as symbol of resistance, of silenced rage, of female power in a patriarchal world. Students debated whether she should be remembered as villain or revolutionary. Others, less charitable, painted her as a sociopath, a calculating servant who relished the power of destruction. Psychology framed her as trauma embodied, a woman so broken by her station that she turned vengeance into ritual. Her humming became pathology, her smile at the bride's collapse reinterpreted as dissociation. In this reading, she was not supernatural at all, just a woman whose pain had hardened into cruelty. And then there was folklore, which ignored history and psychology altogether. Around campfires and in kitchens, people spoke of her as a ghost who still lingered. Some claimed she walked among fields at harvest time, watching those who reaped abundance, ensuring they remembered her famine of death. Others believed she slipped into every household at least once in a lifetime, peering into pots, humming to test the food, deciding whether to bless or curse. The legends became moral tools. Churches used her to preach obedience. She was proof of what happened when servants strayed from their place. Parents used her to instill discipline. She punished waste, disobedience, greed. Communities used her to explain tragedy. When crops failed, when illness spread, when storms destroyed homes, they whispered, "The maid walks again." Yet beneath the layers of myth, one question remained unanswered. What truly happened to her? Each version contradicted the others, but all insisted on finality. Hanging, fire, swamp, or wandering ghost, the possibilities themselves became the legend, an endless smoke that slipped through fingers. The search for truth only created more stories, each retelling reshaping her image. For some she was villain, devil's handmaid. For others she was victim, crushed until she snapped. For others still, she was justice incarnate, the voice of ancestors silenced too long. And as time passed, her story was less about her and more about those who told it. Plantation owners passed it down as warning against rebellion. Descendants of slaves retold it as resistance preserved in memory. Folklorists recorded it as haunting proof of how trauma bends into myth. Each version distorted, reshaped, twisted into new forms. She became monster, martyr, feminist icon, vengeful spirit, sometimes all at once. The more people searched for truth, the more it slipped into smoke, impossible to pin down. That was the power of her legend. Not that it could be proven, but that it refused to die. And so, when the farmhouse collapsed into ruins, when vines swallowed the banquet hall, when the oak tree rotted from the inside, people still swore they heard her. A hum in the kitchen, a creak in the rope, a whisper in the swamp mist. She lived not in flesh but in story, and sometimes story is the most dangerous survival of all. The farmhouse lies in ruins now, a skeleton of brick and timber slowly sinking into the soil. Grass pushes through cracks in the floorboards, ivy coils around shattered windows, and the wind whistles through doorways that once framed candle-lit halls. Yet those who wander close swear the silence is not complete. They claim the kitchen walls still carry an echo, soft, almost imperceptible, the tune of a lullaby once hummed by the maid as she stirred her pots. A song of comfort twisted into legend, a melody that became a curse. And so the questions linger unanswered. Was she simply a woman crushed beneath the weight of servitude? Her humanity warped until she struck back in the only way she could, a mortal hand delivering a final act of defiance? Or was she something older, something darker, a vessel for forces whispered of in both church sermons and African-rooted rituals? Some say she brewed poisons, others swear she brewed shadows. History does not decide. Psychology insists her actions can be explained. Trauma, rage, the corrosion of empathy by relentless cruelty. Religion demands a simpler verdict: sin, possession, the devil's mark upon a servant's hand. Folklore, however, offers no clarity, only smoke. Curses, hauntings, lullabies that travel through kitchens like wandering spirits. Perhaps she was hanged beneath the old oak. Perhaps she was burned, her ashes mingling with the fields. Perhaps she slipped into the swamps, her footsteps dissolving into mud, her voice carried forever in the reeds. Or perhaps she never left at all. Survivors swore her shadow flickered across the walls long after her body was gone. Children still whisper that her spirit stirs any pot left unwatched. The family's fate remains equally obscured. Did they die by arsenic? By ground herbs carried from distant lands? By glass crushed so fine it became invisible in the wine? Or were their convulsions, their visions, their screams born of something beyond medicine? Something not of this world? Science gives fragments, religion offers judgment, folklore breathes fire into silence. None, however, provides certainty. The tale survives precisely because it refuses to end. It lingers in whispers passed down at supper tables, in the cautionary warnings of parents, in the sermons of preachers, in the shiver that runs down a spine when a spoon rattles against a pot. She endures not in flesh but in story, and story can outlast stone. And now the final question passes to you. Was this sweet macabre revenge nothing more than a mortal woman's desperate strike against tyranny? Or was it the work of something far more sinister, far more eternal, an echo that will hum in kitchens long after the ruins have crumbled into dust?